Well, as we continue this morning with our series on spiritual gifts, we come now to the most recognizable portion of the letter, and quite possibly the most familiar chapter in the entire New Testament, and that's 1 Corinthians 13, also known as the love chapter. Now, there are many reasons why this passage is so popular with people. The content, of course, is a big part of it. But I think it's the language and the imagery and the rhythm of the text that really makes it a favorite for people, especially at wedding ceremonies. So pay attention, Mike and Kate. As we read through this chapter and we listen, I just want you guys to be listening for that, okay? We'll be spending a lot of time digging into the content, but let's begin by just focusing on the beauty of what's being said and the way that it's being said, because that's a huge part of what this chapter is all about as well. So can we do that? All right, here we go. 1 Corinthians 13, beginning with verse 1. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge. And if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. May I have the rings, right? You may kiss the bride. I mean, that's kind of like what you expect after reading this passage, right? But I think that says something about the timeless impact that this passage has had on people, whether they're Christians or not. Which I think is really amazing that these words that were written 2,000 years ago still speak to people and are so familiar to people. But at the same time, I think that familiarity can also work against us. We hear this passage and we immediately think, oh yeah, that's the love chapter. I know that one. But do we really know it? And do we know it in the context that it was written? Or do we only know it as a favorite passage that's typically read at a wedding ceremony? Now, it's not to say that we shouldn't read this passage at a wedding. I think this is an excellent passage to read at a wedding. And the fact that it can stand on its own like that says something about how profound this chapter really is. But because we're so used to hearing it in the context of a wedding instead of a discussion on spiritual gifts, I think there's a lot we end up missing in this passage as well. I don't know if you remember this from last week, but right before this chapter begins, Paul tells us to earnestly desire spiritual gifts. And then as soon as that chapter's over, he says it again in chapter 14 and verse 1. Earnestly desire spiritual gifts. At which point he launches into an entire teaching on tongues and prophecy, which we will get into in a couple of weeks. And so I think it's important for us to realize that Paul's not like sitting down, all busy writing about spiritual gifts, and then all of a sudden he stands up to stretch his legs for a bit and launch into this amazing chapter on love, get that out of his system, and then sit back down and talk about spiritual gifts again. See, chapter 13 is not an interruption on Paul's teaching on the gifts. It's a part of it. And as we'll see in a few minutes, it's a very important part of it. Which, I mean, if you think about it, that really shouldn't surprise us any. Did you know that there are roughly 400 verses in the Bible that talk about love? And so it's kind of an important topic, right? And not just because of the sheer number of verses about love. That's not, that alone is what makes it important. It's what those verses have to say about love. When Jesus was asked to sum up the entire Old Testament, he boiled it down to what? Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And when Jesus had his disciples together for the last time before he was arrested and led off to be crucified, what did he say to them about what it means to be one of his disciples? People will know that you are my disciples, how? Yeah, by your love for one another. We see that in John chapter 13. And then later on, John says in 1 John 4, he says, anyone who does not love does not know God. Which is a pretty bold statement, right? But that's the reason why love is so important. And why love is a defining mark of a true disciple of Jesus, because love comes from God. 1 John 4:7, beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. See, love isn't just an important thing, it is the most important thing. But the Corinthian church didn't understand that. They thought that tongues was the most important thing, which is why Paul starts off this chapter by saying, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. See, as beautifully as this passage is written and as lyrical and poetic as it sounds, we need to remember why it was written. Otherwise, we'll come away from it saying, well, that was a nice little passage about love, and then miss the whole meaning behind what's being said. It would be like if I said to you, look at this beautiful postcard I have from the Swiss Alps. You'd probably agree, yeah, it's beautiful. But then what are you going to ask me? Who's it from, right? Followed very quickly by, and what are they doing there? In fact, I would venture to say that as familiar as people are with 1 Corinthians 13, probably less than 1% could tell you who wrote it, and less than that could tell you who it was written to and why. But you know, right? Because we've been studying this section of Scripture for like 2 months now. The Apostle Paul is writing this letter to the church in Corinth, which is a very gifted church, but a church with a lot of problems. And one of their problems was the way that they handled spiritual gifts, like the gift of tongues, which the Corinthians valued more than any of the other gifts. We'll see how Paul deals with that in a few weeks. But what I want us to see this morning is this. Paul doesn't just pull a hypothetical example out of the air and say, oh, I don't know, if I could speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love. No, what he's doing is he's drawing attention to the very thing that the people he's writing to valued most and practiced the most. And he's saying, okay, guys, listen up. I know you like to speak in tongues and all, but you're not doing it in love. And so you sound like a banging gong or a clashing cymbal, and it's not very attractive at all. Kind of changes the feel of the whole passage a little bit, doesn't it? But that's what Paul is saying, and he doesn't stop there. Paul, being the humble guy that he is, turns his attention next to the gifts that he values the most. Look at verse 2. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. Paul, as we'll see in chapter 14, thinks very highly of the gift of prophecy and all of the revelatory gifts, like words of wisdom and knowledge and the discerning of spirits. And we'll see later on why that is. And of course, faith is something that Paul talks a lot about too and values a lot. My entire life, Paul says in Galatians chapter 2, is lived by faith in the Son of God. But as he says here, without love, I'm nothing. And so Paul draws attention both to what he values and to what the Corinthian church values. And I kind of think this last one points to what the world tends to value when it comes to being spiritual, and that's generosity. You know, one of the biggest criticisms that we often hear about the church is that the church only cares about money. And the bigger the church is, the more money is a target on their back. And a lot of times it is a problem. But the point I want to make is this. It's when Christians are generous and churches are generous that people tend to stand up and take notice. Because that's what the world thinks is important when it comes to religion and spirituality. But Paul even addresses that when he says in verse 3, if I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned but have not love, I gain nothing. And so Paul takes everything that everyone thinks is important and basically says, if I have all of that in the greatest measure possible but have not love, I gain nothing. That seems a little over the top, doesn't it? I mean, you think you gain something, especially after giving everything that you own away to the poor. I mean, you'd think that, I don't know, you get at least a B- for that. But see, if I do it to feel good about myself, or to draw attention to myself, or even for religious reasons, to try and, I don't know, score some points with God or something, Paul says if that's why I'm doing it, I gain nothing. I gain nothing spiritual for all of these, quote, spiritual things that I'm doing, unless I have love. Now, I think most of us understand that love is important, right? We understand our need for love, and we understand our need to do a better job at loving God and loving others. But what does that really mean? What does love look like? Well, Paul tells us in the next few verses. Now, most of these verses tell us what love doesn't look like, and we'll talk about why Paul does that in just a moment. But Paul begins by describing love this way in verse 4. Love is patient and kind. Okay, so right off the bat, we see that love can only be described in the context of how we respond to other people. In other words, love can't exist in a vacuum. I can only be patient and kind when I'm in the presence of another person. And so love can only operate in relationship with other people. And I think that says a lot about what it really means to be spiritual, about what it means to truly follow Jesus. It's not something we can do on our own. Now, that's not to say that things like personal prayer and Bible study and meditating on scriptures, that things like that aren't important, because they are. But if love really is foundational to what it means to be a Christian, and the bulk of our spiritual life is devoted to things that we do in private, or maybe in the same room with other people, but with very limited interaction, if that's what my spiritual life looks like just this, then maybe we're a lot more like the Corinthians than we care to admit. See, the Corinthians had this whole church thing figured out. At least they thought they did. They got together on Sundays, they worshiped together, they prayed together, they listened to sermons, they shared in communion, they even shared meals together. But in all of their religious activity, the Corinthian church still couldn't manage to keep love at the center of their lives. Now, they were a very smart church. They had a lot of knowledge, but their knowledge made them proud. They were wise, they had wisdom, but their wisdom led to quarrels and disagreements that eventually ended up driving them apart. They moved in the gifts of prophecy and tongues, but they didn't do it in a way that built the church up. or even in a way that allowed visitors who came to the church, who maybe weren't believers yet, to understand what was being said. In other words, they cared more about their gifts and their talents than they did about people. They cared more about pursuing excellence in the things that they did than they did about pursuing love. Love is patient with people and kind to people, the way that God is patient and kind with us. Not because we deserve it, but because that's what love looks like. Now, it's not easy to be patient and kind to people who don't deserve it, right? Which is why we happen to be more familiar with what love doesn't look like. And that's where Paul goes next. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. See, we may have trouble understanding what love really looks like, but you know what it looks like to be rude, right? Especially where we live. We know what this is like. Pretty familiar with that. How about arrogant and boastful? Do you know what that looks like? To insist on your own way, to only do things the way that you're comfortable with? How about what it's like to be irritable? Can you think of people who irritate you? Just go ahead, close your eyes for a moment and try and picture that person that really irritates you. Some of you are thinking, yeah, right now it's you, John. But see, these are the things that we're more familiar with, right? The Corinthians certainly were. And that's why Paul brings them up here. And again, these aren't just random examples that Paul's giving. These are things that he has already identified as being serious issues in the church. In chapter 5, for instance, Paul says to them, "You're arrogant, and your boasting is not good." And then later on in chapter 6, he says, "All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful." In other words, don't insist on doing things your own way just because you can. Think about how it affects other people first. And so Paul's just running through the whole list here, and he's saying, you know all those awful things you guys are doing? Just stop doing that, and you'll be moving in the right direction. Kind of gives you a whole different feel for the love chapter, doesn't it? Not so romantic anymore. Trust me, when this letter was first read to the Corinthian church, and they got to this part, nobody was swooning, okay? Nobody was like, oh, what a beautiful lyrical composition on the subject of love. Nobody was saying that. What they were probably saying was, is he talking about me? I kind of think he's talking about me there. Come to think of it, that's actually a pretty good exercise. Let's take a look at these verses again. And wherever you see the word love, replace it with your name. And see how it makes you feel. See if you end up wincing anywhere when you read it. John is patient and kind. John doesn't envy or boast. He's not arrogant or rude. He doesn't insist on his own way. He's not irritable or resentful. That's about as far as I got before I felt the need to repent, right? Anybody else feel that way? But see, that's the point. That's the whole point that Paul is trying to make with this passage. Love as God defines love cannot be found in ourselves. It doesn't exist. Look, nobody is born to love. We're born with a need for love, but not with the capacity to truly love. And if you do try and find that in yourself, then you're going to end up redefining what love really is. I found this interesting quote from a psychology professor named Barbara Fredrickson, and it comes from a book she wrote called Love 2.0. The title of the book suggests that love needs an upgrade. And what does that upgrade look like? Well, according to Fredrickson, quote, love's time scale is far shorter than we typically think. Love, as you'll see, is not lasting. And perhaps most challenging of all, love is not unconditional. Now, I do have to say that this, quote, upgrade does make a lot of sense. In other words, this new definition of love is very logical. Dr. Fredrickson has done an excellent job recognizing the limitations of human love. And so what does she do? Well, she redefines it so that it's more in line with what love typically looks like. But see, there's a problem with Love 2.0. Nobody wants it. Nobody's searching for it. It's a love without meaning or significance or mystery. Going from biblical love to Love 2.0 is like swapping my smartphone out for a pager. It's not an upgrade. But what choice do we have if this definition of love really is more realistic and more in line with what we expect to experience in our lives? Well, we do have a choice. And that choice begins by recognizing the fact that in our pursuit of love, we have made a terrible mistake. We've positioned love within ourselves. Love is something that we say, or it's something that we do, or it's something that we feel or experience. But see, as soon as we position love within ourselves, we end up redefining love and making it something less than what it really is. If love is to be what we know love to be, in all of its mystery and beauty and significance and permanence, then it must by necessity come from outside of us. Love isn't something that we say or do or even feel. It's something that happens to us. It's something that exists outside of us and then miraculously comes to us and works through us and ultimately transforms us. That's why there's only one name that we can replace the word love with in this passage, and that's Jesus. Jesus is patient and kind. Jesus does not envy or boast. He's not arrogant or rude. He doesn't insist on his own way. Remember the Garden of Gethsemane? Not my will, but yours be done. He's not irritable or resentful. He doesn't rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Jesus bears all things, even our sin. Believes all things, even when we're faithless, he remains faithful. Hopes all things and endures all things. Jesus is patient with us and kind to us and always interceding for us. There is nothing we can do to make Jesus love us any less. His love never ends. As for prophecies, however, they will pass away. Verse 8. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, who's perfect? Jesus is perfect. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Here's what Paul's saying, and then we'll take some time to respond. The Corinthian church believed that they had reached the pinnacle of what it means to be a church because their worship services were full of tongues and prophecy and words of knowledge. See, they thought that the presence of spiritual gifts in their church was all the proof they needed that they had finally arrived. And so Paul's attempting to adjust their perspective a little bit here by saying, look, there's things that are important right now that won't necessarily be all that important later. Just like there's things that you did as a child that you don't continue doing as an adult, there's things that are meant for now, and there's things that will come later. And so spiritual gifts are important now, but when we see Jesus face to face, we're not going to need them anymore. There's not going to be any need for revelatory gifts like knowledge and prophecy when everything's already been revealed. There's not going to be any need for gifts of healing and gifts of miracles when there's no more sickness and no more death. So don't make an idol out of something that's not going to last, but instead focus on what's really important. What are the gifts for? What's the end game? Well, Paul tells us right here. Faith, hope, and love. That's what's important. See, when God reveals himself to people through prophetic words or gifts of healing or working of miracles, what happens? What should happen? Well, first of all, faith should happen. If we didn't believe before, we should believe now. That's what Jesus told his disciples in John 14. He said, believe me, or else believe on account of the works themselves. Talked about that a few weeks ago. And so spiritual gifts are meant to help us with our faith. But they're also meant to give us hope. When God heals us and works miracles for us, it gives us a taste of what heaven's going to be like when there is no more sickness and death. And so the gifts help us to look to eternity and to the hope that we have in Christ. That one day, this body, with all of its imperfections, will be changed in the blink of an eye into a perfect one. And so the gifts remind us of that and give us hope. Faith, hope, and then finally love, which Paul says in verse 13 is the greatest of the three because it's the only one that lasts forever. No need for faith in heaven because nothing will be hidden. Everything will be revealed. And there's no need for hope either because everything we hoped for in this life will fully come to pass when we see Jesus face to face. But love's a whole different story. God's love for us and one day our love for him will be perfect and will never end. And that's why love is the most important thing. See, it's not that the gifts aren't important, but we need to see them with the right perspective. Don't pursue the gifts for the sake of the gifts. Pursue love instead. In fact, that's the very next thing that Paul says in chapter 14 and verse 1. Pursue love and earnestly desire spiritual gifts, which now that we understand what love really is, makes total sense, doesn't it? Spiritual gifts, and we talked about this several weeks ago, spiritual gifts are the manifestation of the Spirit of God, who happens to be the only source of true love. See, if we're really pursuing love as love is meant to be pursued, then we should eagerly desire that the Spirit of God, who is the source of love, would manifest himself through us. Because as we said earlier, the only love that we have to offer on our own is love 2.0, and well, who really wants that? Do people really want a love that's conditional? Do people really want a love with an expiration date? Or do they want a love that never ends? A love that doesn't depend on them, but instead happens to them and works through them and ultimately transforms them. As followers of Jesus, that's the love that we've been given. And it's the same love that we have the privilege to give to others as well. But only to the extent that we surrender to his love and allow his love to be manifested through us. Amen.